going to have a very large group, and so I'll ask everyone to please keep themselves on mute as we go through the session, but do use the chat box as liberally and as freely as you're comfortable using it, because that's the way we're going to know what you're thinking and what questions are most on your mind. Let me begin by just saying a word or two about the community of practice and about today's session. For those of you who are not currently members, the community of practice was established about 7 years ago now and has some 800 members and 9 working groups. It's a group of people, all volunteers, who are focused on a single issue, which is namely, how do things that are successful at a modest scale ever reach the scale that's proportional or commensurate with a problem? And that sounds like a simple question, but it turns out to have a pretty complicated set of answers. And we've been spending the last 6 or 7 years trying to get to the bottom of some of those questions and some of those answers. The community of practice has several activities that I'll bring to the attention of those of you who aren't already familiar. As I mentioned, it's got 9 working groups. It does a quarterly newsletter. We've done 20 of those. It has a website where the newsletters and much more is archived. It's www.scalingcommunityofpractice, all one big word, .com. It runs an annual event of which we've done 5. The last one having been, in a sense, the direct precursor for today's session. The last one, which was in October of last year, focused on a variety of cross-cutting issues that were involved in scaling and resulted in a paper that we commissioned that highlighted 10 of those issues. Those 10 issues, we then went through and tried to pick out some order of or sequencing to deal with, and the very first of those is this issue, namely the relationship between a focus on systems change and a direct focus on scaling. You'll hear a lot about that during this morning's session, but I'll just say a tiny word, which is that many of us are involved as either practitioners or analysts supporting the scaling process. And for us, the entry point is often something that's working that we're hoping to take to scale. But there's some of us who begin the other way, who begin looking at the systems into which we're scaling and what needs to happen to change those systems. And strangely, but no longer surprisingly to us, we tend to find each other somewhere in the middle, sometimes in a confusing little minuet and sometimes more constructively. And our focus today is to try and understand what it means to come to a problem from the systems perspective, what it means to come to it from a transactional or a scaling perspective, and how those two interact and cross-cut. We're going to do this until we get to the bottom of this problem. If that means more webinars, more papers, we're going to do it. And then we're going to move on to the second of our scaling cross-cutting issues, which is how to mainstream a focus on scaling into organizations, whether they be donor organizations, implementing organizations, or foundations. For today's session, we've got 2 high-powered moderators, Jenny Perlman Robinson from Brookings and Liz Vance from IYF, and 2 knock your socks off presenters, Kevin Starr from the Malago Foundation and Daniel Kehrer from GIZ. With nothing more to say by way of introduction, let me hand off to Jenny and Liz to take us into the session. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I predict you will.
Great, thanks so much, Larry. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. As Larry said, I'm Jenny Perlman Robinson, and I am delighted to co-moderate today's session along with my colleague Liz Vance from International Youth Foundation. And I see that I think we have more than 200 RSVPs for this conversation. So clearly, Daniel and Kevin draw a lot. So while we won't have time to unfortunately introduce us all, certainly, we thought it'd be nice to get a sense of who all is in the virtual room with us. So Natalie, if I could please ask you to put forward the poll question. We're going to ask you all 2 just quick questions to get a sense of who's with us. Give us 1 second for that to load. All right. So our first question that should be coming up, I think it's in the chat box, right? Maybe it's coming up on your screen and my computer's a little slower. But the first question is, before this event, were you already a member of the global community of practice of scaling development outcomes? Or is this your first time joining, or you're not sure? You wouldn't mind clicking and hitting submit. We'll get a sense of who is with us. Okay, great. We have some members returning, but a fair amount of individuals who are new to the group. So certainly a very warm welcome to you all. And as Larry said, really encourage you to join the scaling community of practice. Leonard kindly put the link in the chat box, but again, it's scalingcommunityofpractice.com. So the next question is, Natalie, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up, is what sector do you represent? So in a moment, you'll see government, NGO, funder, research institution, private sector, or other. People seeing that and able to respond? Looks like it, at least in the chat. Great. So fair number from non-governmental sector, also a number of researchers, private sector, some funders, and some others. Well, that's great. Clearly a good diversity of opinions and perspectives with us today, which is great to bring to the conversation and certainly helps when we're talking about something like systems, because where we sit certainly informs and influences our perspective, what we see, what we are able to do. So along with Liz, I now have the pleasure to introduce our two esteemed speakers, who, as Larry mentioned, we'll hear from briefly before Liz and I move into a moderated panel conversation, and then we'll open it up to a conversation, questions, comments from you all. We ask, as Larry said, please don't be shy. Put your questions, your comments, your ideas in the chat box as both speakers are presenting, and then again, we'll open it up for you all to have a chance to ask your questions during the Q&A as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Kehrer, and forgive my German, I already apologized to him in advance. Daniel works as an advisor on environmental issues, risk management, and transformative change for the German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ. He's involved in developing and supporting projects around the world and advancing complex notions and concepts, such as the recent piece he co-authored on transformative change. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read this report, I highly recommend it. It's called Transforming Our Work and Getting Ready for Transformational Projects. Leonard, I might ask if you haven't already done it to please put the link to the report. Thank you in the chat box. This report was published by GIZ last February. And what you'll see is that I think it really provides both an ambitious vision of transformational scale, but along with real clarity and clearly defined definitions and concepts and terminology, insightful analysis, as well as some practical guidance around how to think about transformational change and the role of projects in that. So Daniel comes to this work with a background in ecology, sustainability sciences, and science-society policy interface. So welcome, Daniel. It's a pleasure to have you join us. Liz, can I hand it over to you?
It's my pleasure. It's actually my pleasure to introduce Kevin Starr. Kevin Starr will be our second speaker today, and he leads the Mulago Foundation. He began his career in medicine and started work with the Mulago Foundation in the mid-90s. In 2003, after spending nearly a decade in the field, he established Mulago's Rainier Arnold Fellows Program as the main on-ramp for Mulago funding, and this Fellows Program helps great social entrepreneurs design for impact and strategize for scale. Kevin was also the primary instigator of Big Bang Philanthropy, a group of funders that work together effectively to direct more money to those best at fighting poverty. In addition, Kevin has written paradigm-shifting pieces for the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Most recently, he published one titled, "We're Beating Systems Change to Death," where he argued that systems change is more a destination than a journey, and that scalable solutions might be a better way to make the trip. That article was a major inspiration for this webinar, and I hope Leonard is able to assist us putting the link there. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us today. Now, each speaker will provide a brief framing of this issue. We're going to give each speaker 10 minutes to speak from their perspective on the issues of scaling and systems change, which may include how do you define these terms, how are you approaching it, where you see the intersections and differences in both the conceptual and the practical side of addressing these concepts in their work. Now, I'd encourage, again, everyone, as these speakers are presenting, to please register your comments and questions in the chat. It will help us to prioritize our moderation of the discussion and also build a robust question answer period. So I guess we'll begin with Daniel. And Daniel, given your perspective, how would you engage in or work on scaling versus systems change, considering the who, how, and when?
Thank you so much. Thank you for welcoming me to this round, actually as an outsider to the scaling community, coming from this more transformational change perspective. And how would I approach the two issues? Well, I think transformative or systems change in general as a goal naturally comes with scaling or mainstreaming as a to-do. So if we think at systems change, to me, scaling is just another aspect to it, a side of the coin. And yeah, how would I approach it? I would try to combine, always push and pull, bottom up and top down perspectives, systemic perspectives, and of course, diffusion of transformative or system changing innovations from bottom up. So far for the beginning.
Thank you, Daniel. We'd love to hear and see your presentation on this item as well.
Should I continue already?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll start sharing, sorry for that misunderstanding, I'll start sharing my screen then. With the title, 1 second please. Trying to get you back to the screen as well. So with the title,
perfectly.
Sorry? Okay. Let me take the time as well. So yeah, thanks again for inviting me. And my framing would be actually trying to find new ways for acting our way into new ways of transformative change as a very important framing already. I think related to that question, systems change and scaling, a very important notion would be the question for the beginning, why actually transformation? I'm mostly referring to transformative systems change right now. And we observe, of course, we observe so-called inadvertent transformations like industrialization that happened or still happens at some points. Inadvertent like digitalization that happens, and we can think about how to design that more in a sustainable way, and deliberate transformative change, systems change, coming from the agendas like climate agenda 2030 and so on, the European Green Deal as another example. And why actually do they talk about? Because they believe, or the assumption behind always is that we can't reach certain goals we might have within recent systems. Therefore, systems change, or even transformative system change, including economic goals or the way we think economies that might not deliver enough, for example, on climate change, on inequalities as well. And with the COVID crisis, of course, right now, delivering more food to that discussion about fundamentally questioning recent systems. And just one example about why it's important to also look into probably something we call deep system change. Take competition as a economic narrative, for example. And let me cite Christian Felber, who says, the one who causes the biggest damage has the biggest competitive advantage. So if we continue to just kind of scratch the surface in, for example, trying to change behavior or work on environmental social standards or something like that, we kind of are still at the surface of fundamental system rationals we work in. And if we don't question, for example, that competition and growth paradigm it leads to, we might miss out. We might continue be working within systems we actually believe that can't work or might work not in general as much as they could or should. So this is why we might think about how to change these deep patterns as well. And let me make that differentiation between incremental change and reforms that would then serve on improving existing systems, and transformation as a alternative that would offer actually a new system, a radical innovation, under the assumption that that new system would perform better on any type of goal we might have. So in a way, we looking at ecological, social, and economic crises that are still ongoing, we could say it's kind of time to repaint that picture and time for transformations. We have a couple of design principles that are clustered around, for example, what do we believe should happen? And the first one would obviously be to actually show that and jointly define that paradigm shift or system transformation from A to B, and what's the difference towards incremental change, for example, and reforms. So, for example, from here to here, or if you think at agriculture transformation from here to something like that, or something like that, or from here to here, if we think at economic patterns, for example, from GDP to quality of life and common good, from infinite growth to limited growth within boundaries and sufficiency, from self-regulation to democratic co-determination, from competition to cooperation. And if we look at the map of anticipated transformations, there are many, and they all tend to be interconnected. For example, we might not reach carbon neutral societies without energy transitions, mobility transformations, agricultural transformations, and so on. And maybe not without transforming the economy as well, again. So scaling, for example, could also mean looking at the scope here on that map and broadening it, getting to higher system levels and so on. But of course, scaling still also means then mainstreaming that new idea or diffusing it into society and getting to a certain level of mainstream, of course. Without that, it wouldn't be a transformation in the end, at least. And this again doesn't say anything about the system level we are in. So it could mean, for example, at the city or communal level, getting to a certain mainstream, for example, if you think at mobility transformations. But it could also mean getting from there to a national level or even global level in the end. So scaling or diffusion, and in the first place, doesn't say anything here in that concept about the level we start or we want to end. And resilience as another very important link, I think, as well between scaling and systems change, because there are many system aspects like the legal framework, political decisions, institutions, incentives, but also social change, education, justice, social contracts, and so on, that all play a role in the resilience of new emerging systems. And on the other side, our attempts to destabilize or weaken the resilience of recent systems. So that, of course, will play a crucial role for scaling as well. And social change. Because, of course, large systems change or transformations is much about fundamental values, beliefs, norms, and behavior. So, and we have very different interest groups within society, of course, or target groups, if you want so. So it's a great challenge to think about how to even possibly facilitate that social change in values and norms. And if we look back to the ozone hole problem, for example, we see that we managed in the past. It was possible we have examples of large-scale social change and technological change. Or if we think at people that acted as catalysts, as change agents, so to say. And we have many approaches towards social change, from education, communication, social learning, or even governance approaches. Just one example, for example, how we can reach, or millions of people to reach with so-called transitional characters within fictional formats, like within this transmedia soap in India, for example. Already advancing shifts in values and norms. And another cluster is around how could it happen? And this is starts with multidimensional approaches that we would like to see, actually, because these larger transformations never go alone within just one of the dimensions. Like it's not just a technological or infrastructure question. As said, it's much about social change. It's about different ways of thinking economy and incentives. It's about politics and so on. So we should be able, at least all together, addressing all of these components for a transformation field. Facilitation, reciprocability, justice play a large role, of course, if we think at other attempts in the past, and appreciating that we are in the so-called VUCA world, that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and or dealing with so-called wicked problems, high uncertainty and very different values involved. So reciprocal relationships and on many levels, like participation, information flow, and so on, play a big role. Justice issues play a big role, and perceived justice and really tangible justice, and rituals in terms in order to support that. And last but not least, complexability, our ability to deal with complex systems. And our assumption is that our recent ways of implementation are not yet fit for complex problems or wicked problems. I'm almost coming to an end. The recent project cycles we work in and management paradigms are still to large parts influenced by the 1910s management paradigms. So they optimize for complicated or simple problems, actually. And again, we are in the VUCA world, and we tend to regularly trap into that impact complexity trap with very good impact promises, complex realities, deviation from there, and then trying to adapt and getting even more rigid systems and so on. Yeah, maybe 1-2 minutes, that would be great. Thank you. And we could ask how much time, for example, for solving the climate issue, how much time do we have for these big project cycles that are very, take long preparation times and have problems with relevance, impact, and so on? Or should we think about different modes of implementation that are really optimized for that complex world where we probe and invent, experiment and test and sense again and so on? And do this in a co-productive way as much as possible to actually getting, in the end, that's the kind of paradox, starting very small and fast iterative and have fast iterations, in the end to be better able to get that emergence and that growth and scaling to a level it can take. So there could be very interesting experimentation fields we could think of in terms of these fast iterative cycles, flexible funding, and so on. Let's talk later about this. And yeah, different ways of combining many interventions in terms of instead of projects around these transformation fields or system change fields. So yeah, let's be brave and engage in brave experiments to act our way into new ways of scaling transformative change. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Kevin, I would love to invite you to share your perspective about how you engage in or work on scaling or systems change, considering the who, how, and when.
Thanks a lot. Can you all hear me okay?
Wonderful. Yes, thank you.
So everything I've learned from the social entrepreneur world. And we define the social entrepreneur as somebody with a good idea about a big problem who launches an organization to try to create change at scale. I'm going to start with definitions. I don't know if you guys have figured out how to share my slides. And I'll just tell you when to change the slide. We all had, these were all animated and Microsoft Teams didn't cooperate, so here we go. So scale isn't a number for us. It's if the size of the problem is huge, we think of a solution reaching its full potential is what scale means. And scaling is, if you think of impact over time, scaling is when the replication of that solution really takes off and blasts out of a linear replication to exponential. Next slide. So, whoops, there we go. So if you look at impact and replication over time, linear growth is great. Linear growth of replication is awesome, but it doesn't solve problems. To solve problems, you got to get to exponential. And so we call it scaling when somebody gets onto that steep part of the curve. Next slide. Yeah, just start animating in like crazy. So here's the journey to scale. You start with an idea down on the left-hand side. You go through the R&D stage to turn it into a model that can be systematically replicated. And over time, you replicate it enough to prove that you have a systematic model. And then you go up to the right-hand side, and where you're trying to get to is full potential. And with full potential is defined for us sort of by what we call a where it would work list. What's the overlap of who needs it and how, where would it work? And the two really important concepts here about replication at scale, about getting to full potential, is you have to figure out who the doer and the payer are. And there's only 4 doers. The doer is who replicates the solution at really big scale, the solution that you came up with way back on the idea end. And there's only 4 choices. Either you replicate it at scale, and that's awfully rare, or lots of NGOs, or lots of businesses, or governments. And with the payer, who really pays for this replication at scale, there's also only 4. It's either customers for for-profits, government, big aid, or private philanthropy. And so if we go back to what gets you from R&D into replication, you see the little print there. And one is getting to a replicable, systematic, doable model that can be replicated. And then looking at what scalability is. And the first question is it big enough? Does it have a scope that really matters? Is it simple enough for your doer to do, whoever you've foreseen as your doer, whether it's NGOs, businesses, or governments? And is it cheap enough for your payer to pay? Because everybody from a mom buying a stove to a finance minister looking at a new health program has a price point. And we want to understand whether a model is cheap enough for them to pay. And finally, a persuasive case for impact, because rarely can you do the big fancy studies at this point. And then the next stage, going from replication to scaling, is you've really honed your model. You've replicated a lot. You've got the system sorted out. The costs are down. And you know the big enough, simple enough, cheap enough questions that much better. Here's where you've got to have the rigorous proof of impact, because you don't want to take anything to scale unless it really works. And then you want to be big shift ready. And big shift is that circle right before things take off. It isn't just magic. And what we've found is there's I think you need to press the animation one more time. There's 6 things that really make things take off. One is, and it's really the most important, is replication goes from you to the doer at scale, whomever that is. The payer starts to pay for it instead of usually private philanthropy in the beginning. There's often a tech solution that helps amplify and accelerate impact. And then as an organization gets bigger and replicates more, they start to see where policy would lower barriers or open doors. And there's opportunities for collective action where you can start collaborating with other organizations that are doing the same thing you are or different things, or even create a larger movement. Next slide. So if you've got enough bottom-up scalable solutions going big, you start to see sort of an emergent systems change happen. And there's a lot of activities you can do, some of what Daniel was talking about, to help the bottom-up energy meet the top-down enabling or even acceleration. And that's when spectacular change can really happen. Next slide. So I just had 4 things that I wanted to just state outright and end on. One is systems change is super hard, as you might have seen with Daniel's presentation. Mostly in my world, we use systems. We don't really change them, which is a lot of the reason I thought systems change was something that we might use a little less. The best system change, I think, is emergent from the work of doers who are obsessed with scaling. And emergent systems change itself requires a lot of people working on scalable solutions and taking them to scale to see systems really change. And voila, that's all I got.
Kevin, thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. Before we go into the panel discussion, we'd like to poll the audience. We know that, as Larry mentioned in the beginning, we have a lot of practitioners, experts, researchers, and funders in the field. And we invite you to take a picture of this QR code on your screen and then use the code 92611607, which will help us. And once you're there, you can use your cell phone. You're going to see the following question. And what we want to know is, from your position where you sit, to what degree which systemic considerations need to be taken into account? Have you resolved in your work the degree to which systemic considerations need to be taken into account when you're scaling impact? And we'd like you to slap yourself on a scale. Have you considered this? Have you taken it into account? Do you feel like you've completely resolved this question with your work? And this will help us to prioritize our panel discussions.
Liz, there's a request if it's possible to put the QR code back. Folks might not have had a chance to use it.
Now it seems as though the participants on this call are in the same position that many of the people that organize this call are, which is that this is something that we're engaging with, we're thinking about, we're trying to take into consideration, but we don't feel like we've completely resolved it. So we would like to continue to collect the responses on this throughout the course of the call. And we also invite, fantastic, we also invite everyone to please continue to put their comments and questions in the chat, which will help us to moderate the question and answer. So we're going to turn now to some critical questions for Kevin and Daniel. And I hope also this sort of pulse of the room. Oh, excuse me, we have one second question. We would like to know if you feel like you have resolved this, or if you're considering it, or addressing or resolving it. What does it look like? What were the results? How are you doing this? Please take a moment in the word cloud that'll appear to enter a brief description of what this might look like, and we can sort of see where you guys are at. So we have some stuff around collaboration, public-private partnerships, collective impact. We also have, this is complicated, you have to map. You need evidence-informed approaches. There's some about failing and adaptive learning cycles, failing fast. And this we will be collecting, just so you know, so that we can continue to learn from people. Some people are using the MSI scaling framework. There's a lot of conversation about incentives and power. There's someone who talks about, what are we trying to scale? Are we trying to scale an intervention? Or are we trying to scale an impact? There's also a lot of conversation about timing. What's the timing of systems change? Is it something that happens fast or slow? Is it uneven in how it advances? There's multiple comments about mapping. So to keep on time, I'm going to move us to our panel discussion. And I have the first question for Kevin and for Daniel. And it's a very complex question. And I'm going to try and impersonate Terry Gross from NPR, who asks very long questions, but gets fantastic and better answers than her questions every time. So I anticipate that from both of you. So my question here is for Kevin, and then from Daniel. We'd love to hear what systemic considerations should be taken into account to improve the chance of achieving minimal sustainable scale. And perhaps the debate here is less about should systems be considered in any efforts to achieve sustainable scale, and more discussions around to what extent should systems be considered. What are your views on this question of how much scaling efforts should take systems into account? And also this issue of timing, when? At what point in the scaling process? Who decides? And should they be the ones taking these decisions? So first, for you, Kevin.
Yeah, I think systemic considerations, systems analysis, systems thinking should be a part of every single step in solutions to scale. Like the idea, you can't come up with a good idea without understanding the systems you're working in. You can't put together, understand the behavior change needed and what's needed to drive that behavior change to get to a decent model without understanding the systems you're in. You can't replicate and grow without understanding the systems you find yourself in the middle of. Every single one of those big shift activities requires an understanding of the system that you find yourself in. So you're never, a successful trip to scale is really never apart from systems considerations.
Thank you so much, Kevin. How about you, Daniel?
Yeah, thanks. I absolutely agree, of course. And I already made that introduction of two sides of the coin. And maybe also to differentiate, to me, systems change and scaling both are not final goals in itself, of course. For example, there might be limits of scaling or growth if we want so. And if we just scale further and further, the thing might turn into a bigger problem even than before. Compare the Green Revolution, for example, and transformation as well. It's not a goal in itself. So we of course we tend to ask for what purpose. And so to me, it remains an interplay. And I really believe that at the interplay, systems kind of need to be ready for scaling as good as possible. So think at urban mobility again, for example. It might be hard to reach a tipping point if we just try to scale car sharing, for example, just for the entire city. If we do not consider, for example, participative and integrated urban planning, infrastructure, a joint vision on urban transformation, political decisions around it, technological investments and divestments. So all these are systemic issues that we need to probably nurture so that as a good soil on which scale solutions can grow or emerge, better to say. So in a way, it's like with agriculture and that transformation as well. So yeah, and I believe that we can't steer towards that result. So think at Rosa Parks, for example, or think at Greta, or think at other events that caused final tipping points within large systems. Fukushima for the energy transition in Germany, for example, or even way back Chernobyl, the catastrophe. So I think we also should get rid of that notion that we can steer towards these tipping points, but rather, yeah, be smart and brave in combining, constructively combining bottom-up and top-down nurturing of systems and growing of really good innovations that can make it. And maybe to differentiate between different types of innovations, I think we have innovations like, think at industrialization. The invention of the steam engine was a kind of game changer for the entire world. And industrialization followed, more or less, put very simple. A car can more or less drive everywhere on the world, more or less. But the question, how do we manage to get climate neutral societies or similar issues? That's much more context driven and dependent, of course, and we can't steer tipping points in such a complex system. So yeah, let's try to get more hands on how to nurture these kinds of scalable solutions and systems and innovations to grow and to nurture these co-creative cycles. And yeah, and maybe a last aspect to it, the issue of timing and with some of the problems and challenges we have, we don't have the time to wait for a kind of natural evolution or natural transformation. So think at climate change. We don't have simply don't have the time to wait another 50 years like it took in Germany for the energy transition so far. It's by far not at the end, of course, but we don't have 50 more years. So we need to think about how to catalyze that type of change. So far on the first one, my first attempt.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. You know, I was struck listening to you both talk that when we started organizing this, this webinar, the working title we had was Scaling versus Systems Change. And, clearly, I think what you, Kevin, and Daniel have both laid out is in many ways much more of a spectrum. And this is certainly, I think, reinforced in the background piece that Richard Cole wrote. And so maybe the question is, I think, as you both have been alluding to and talking about, is to what extent are these systemic considerations taken into account? At what point? How early? What's the pathway to get there? And so forth. And so, I guess as I'm thinking about it, the what of some of these concepts might be a little less controversial. I'm already seeing a lot of great comments come through the chat about, of course, we can't scale without taking into account the broader context in which an innovation sits. But maybe it's truly the application of it, right? The sort of operationalization of thinking about taking systems, an analysis, systems consideration into account that makes it challenging. So I'd love to ask you both, and maybe I'll start with you, Kevin. What are some of the practical challenges and organizational or institutional barriers do scaling efforts face, scalable solutions, if you will, face when taking systems into account? Daniel, you started talking about timelines. Certainly, I think you both talked about incentives, touched upon issues of accountability structures, but it'd be great to hear from you both what you see as some of those practical challenges. And then if you could help us take it a step further to how might both funders and implementers, two groups that you both have experience with, need to either adapt or change to address some of these challenges and barriers. So Kevin, could I turn it over to you first and then Daniel?
So we're really looking at barriers to scaling. Is that sort of the question?
Yeah, barriers to scaling, but really with a sort of systems approach taken into account. In your excellent piece, systems approach, not the issue, it's systems change as a buzzword. So if you could just unpack a little bit what that looks like, practically speaking.
Well, I'll just go to the scaling part itself. If you think about the doer at scale, what we found was that we always told people, hey, getting NGOs to replicate your model at scale is a good idea. Turns out it's not. We wrote a recent piece on called Nowhere to Grow about the fact that the NGO world just doesn't scale stuff up. Wondering why? You start looking at it, well, there's a whole dysfunctional system of how big aid funds big NGOs, and they mostly do projects. They don't scale up solutions. They just do project after project after project, and they don't even measure how most of them work. So you can start to see, the system of markets function poorly, a lot of the places where we're trying to work. And so market-based solutions, you don't have all the ingredients in place, like easy to get financing at decent interest rates that would allow high impact businesses to take off. Governments are always complicated beasts. So, there's a high degree of, everything really happens through relationships. There's a high degree of turnover. Corruption is an issue. Simple competence is an issue. These governments have been starved of resources, and with a long history of oppression, they don't work that well. So really at the scaling stage, systems really, really matter, and whether they're functional or not really, really matters. And things like whether funders are accountable for impact really, really matters. So it's sort of like super important when you're designing a model, getting your solution figured out, just continually more and more important as you try to go up the curve.
And can I just follow up there, Kevin? As a funder, we've been talking about how if one is going to take systems into account, it's a recognition of the complexity, of the unpredictability, of sort of the emergent behavior that come of this. And I'm curious as a funder what that means. Are there any changes in sort of funding practices that either you've learned along the way or that you think might be needed to think about, as you're saying, considering systems in this way?
Yeah, once you look at the solution and you think you have an organization that can deliver, you give them unrestricted funding and you stay in the game until either the thing really takes off or it looks like it never will, and you need to get out.
I appreciate that. Daniel, great to hear from you a bit of sort of the practicality, the application of some of these concepts and ideas. And I just ask, Daniel, you've been doing such a wonderful job of providing us with some concrete examples. To the extent you can continue to do so, I know there's been some requests for that as well in the chat box.
Okay, thanks so much for the question as well. So yeah, I think at the moment, we still have a reflex when we think about more higher ambitions, better scaling options, and so on, to just do what we did all the time, but just in bigger scales. For example, thinking about bigger programs, bigger projects. But the challenge with these bigger projects is that they even take longer in preparation. Think at the GCF, for example, we tend to implement as well projects for the GCF or similar formats. So bigger ambitions at the moment mean higher, longer preparation times to really get that funding proposal straight, get the indicators smart, trying to control everything in advance. Basically, these are predictions of the future. So we want all at the same time, as big as possible, have full control, and want it, and in the best case, even want it alone. So in the end, want to say, we did that as one organization. So there we have the competition framing again, or paradigm again. So other way around, my personal opinion is that we should change all of these patterns and paradigms with two important paradigm shifts I would see. So getting from competition to really consequent cooperation, because many experiences really show that cooperation is the more powerful paradigm compared to competition. We still have that old idea that competition gets us good results or the best results, but there's actually no or very little evidence for that. So if we want to be evidence-based, we should rather engage in cooperation, let everybody do what everybody is strong at, including organizations, find good ways of transparent and joint development governance mechanisms, so that every organization can in a transparent way contribute to a challenge and use its strength beyond competition models. And there are examples already in that direction. And the second bigger paradigm shift I would see would be getting, let change emerge as much as possible. So for example, getting from a funding promise to flexible joint allocation that would lower investment risk. Don't start with let's not start with big funding volumes, but with very small ones. That way we won't have investment risk. We won't have the need for trying to promise everything that's unrealistic anyway. Let's get from an impact promise to a process promise, to promise how we will facilitate, with what kind of facilitative resources and approaches we will facilitate that process, how participatory we can be, and so on. Let indicators get means again and not goals. Indicators in many cases are a part of the problem because they become goals and not means anymore, and tend to provide perverse incentives even, because people just look for their numbers, but forget about looking into what kind of joint sense they actually created beyond these numbers of people trained or whatever. And getting from action, getting into action to knowledge rational, changing that knowledge to action rational into action to knowledge rational, to really be able to start with little small partnerships that emerge, iterative interventions, co-creative interventions, that grow bigger and bigger. And we already started to engage in experiments like that. It's really also, it takes some bravery, of course, on the side of donors as well, to really allow that room for testing these new approaches. But I'm really convinced that these have the potential to come up with more effectiveness, more efficiency, more relevance in the end, more impact in the end. So far on that, my first attempt.
Thank you. So we are, believe it or not, at the end of the panel discussion segment, but I'm pleased to report that we have a lot of great questions from participants. I'm going to do my best to combine and paraphrase three. There were three questions in the chat that had to do with the issue of that systems exist because they're resolving transaction costs, and that there are certain winners that are very invested in these systems, and that sometimes we might even see ourselves in those systems, and that perpetuate inequities. And I guess the question that I'm seeing in these three comments has to do with how do we engage with systems and not reinforce these dysfunctional or systems that perpetuate inequities. And this has questions, there are questions related to the who do you engage? How do you work through systems that don't reach everyone if you're trying to increase equity? And then how do you not just exacerbate the inequities that these systems create? And I know that there's a desire to transform, but how do you work with what's there when what's there is not sufficient? And I'll bring it to Kevin first. Thank you.
That's about half an hour's worth of stuff, but I'll just try to keep it simple. You have to design a solution that can swim in the sea in which it finds itself. So there are scalable solutions that really change, can change a system when they confront it, can change aspects of it that are particularly destructive. But fundamentally, you find a government where you find it, you find a market where you find it, you find a caste system where you find it. And unless you've set out to change it, you've got to figure out a solution that works within the context of it. I think we delude ourselves when we think we can change a lot of these systems. And it's an issue of good design to make sure that we're not reinforcing the badness.
I'm just going to paraphrase because I heard two really interesting things there. One was that it was talking about not only being able to swim in the sea that you're in, but also a solution that can transform those aspects of it that it touches. And I thought that those were two really salient points. Daniel, I'm going to turn this over to you and see if you want to pick up on those themes or address it from a totally different perspective.
Yeah, I agree again. And it really, to me, it relates to the issue of weak or strong institutions as well. For example, institutions can be perceived weak because they are untransparent and unjust in the way power plays a big role in institutions or governments, for example. And one irony to me is that many bureaucracies that we created actually try to solve that problem. But they created a new problem in part, at least, ending up with inflexible and partly even unhuman structures as well, again. And maybe in part not even being able to cope well with so-called wicked problems. If we think at the corona management in Germany, for example, I think it's a deep insult for the German soul that we at the moment don't manage well with our bureaucracies. that wicked problem. So so that's the other extreme, so to say, of very transparent and equal system. Everybody gets treated equally in a bureaucracy, more or less transparent, still with steep hierarchies in part. And that doesn't seem to be a solution to these problems as well. So yeah, I think we should try to be brokers for new forms of governance as well, in that sense, as I also try to introduce, dealing with that wicked world. And we probably may learn from the South as well as the so-called North in that regard. So that relates to reciprocal relationships again. Do we design projects for people or with people, and do they learn from us, or do we learn from them as well? And that will be a shift in power relations already, if we start with us learning from our partners and be open and not so much top-down, global, agenda-driven, and so on. And there are many, I think, and for us, it's really to think at the level of large systems again, or deep system change. I think it's really crucial. It remains crucial to us to be sharp and learn even better to differentiate when do we support a recent system that we actually don't want to support anymore, and when not, or what would be different framings and stories to tell. For example, framings around growth, competition, self-regulation, as said, GDP as the only measure, free market-based solutions, social compensation mechanisms that just compensate of what the system itself probably did wrong. So these kind of framings should probably wake us up and try to think about different stories to tell. And yeah, maybe so far on that. And I think it's possible to engage in that different storytelling on the policy level, on economic level, and so on.
Great. Thanks both. Maybe just following up a little bit on this question of sort of power. There's a number of questions about sort of the who of this conversation. Who's driving the scaling sort of process and making decisions about what needs transformation? And who are those individuals within a system that are both the agents of change? And then how do we think about, for example, when it's someone sitting in government, when we experience in so many countries high turnover of government? So maybe if you all both could speak a little bit more to the who and the power dynamics at play there. Kevin, can I start with you again?
Yeah, I don't engage with anything until somebody has an idea. So to me, a good idea doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go to scale unless somebody's obsessed to take it there. And usually that person fits the description of social entrepreneur. And anything that can scale, anything that can have impact, anything that's worth doing gets designed in the midst of the people it's intended to serve. And so in a fundamental sense, they have the power because they are fundamentally shaping its design. And then all along the pathway, you have various ones in power. I mean, funders hold far too much of the power because they're unaccountable for impact. And that funding is the lifeblood that allows you to get through R&D and into replication. And then when you're trying to go to scale, the power gets kind of diffused all over the place, whether it's some government official or some USAID bureaucrat or any one of a number of people who can make decisions to make or break you in your efforts to get the solution to scale.
Thank you.
Thanks. Daniel, any thoughts a little on the who?
Yeah, I think there can be many different types of who's, of course. If we think at, for example, Rosa Parks again, who decided to remain seated in a bus when a white man stepped in. She didn't even know that she would start a transformation, and at least a legal transformation. Or Greta, again, like a very prominent example, who just decided to remain seated in front of the Swedish government, parliament, and engage in school strike. She in the end, she was very powerful, or shifted to some extent. She shifted power relations by telling a different story that many people tended to follow, including the parents, the scientists, and so on. And so there can be, I think there can be many different types of so-called change agents or catalysts. And of course, it's not always them to really, in the end, cause or only cause tipping points. It might be events as well. That, as said, it might be concerted action. It might be new institutions that we can think of. For example, for public deliberation, there are many initiatives. Think at, for example, what President Macron tried to do in France when he tried to create these civil society council, well, this one council that should play a role as a fourth power within the state regarding central development questions. And there are many smaller and bigger initiatives like that. Rethinking democracy, rethinking, for example, democratize parts of the economy as well as a deep driver of certain power patterns. So if we, for example, manage to democratize parts of the economy and the patterns there, again, make it part of co-determination, then this will shift power structures as well. And I really believe that not everyone who's in power now must feel as a loser in the new system if the people in power now are smart enough to go with time and be future proof, so to say, within a new system or a new story, a new narrative that we find ourselves in. And maybe one point, sorry. To me, always it's kind of a little bit consoling that the belief, at least, that even in autocracies, decision makers to some extent are still dependent on a public perception of common good or well-being. So even autocrats are kind of dependent on that. Otherwise, they create a very a system that's not resilient and can collapse anytime. So even them, and of course in democracies even more, their decision makers remain dependent on public perceptions and of well-being and so on. So if we manage to link that again more strongly, and the same for economy, even global enterprises are to some extent still dependent on our perception of the usefulness of their products and operations, or whether, you know, my grandpa starts buying local products and not so many from China anymore, and that's to me that's the best. If my grandpa can do that, that's one of the best indicators for shifting power relations.
Kevin, do you have a response to that? I just or if you don't, I have burning questions.
I was just listening.
Okay, cool. You know, I'm seeing a lot of questions about and a lot of responses to something that you said, Kevin, which had to do with the accountability of donors. That a lot of people on this chat have echoed that and are interested in hearing more on your thoughts about the accountability of donors. And at the same time, Daniel, I'm seeing a lot of questions about indicators and goals. And I'd love to hear you both speak a little bit more about the issues of goals, values, and indicators, how subjective and how informed by the systems that we're trying to work in they're informed by, and then who is accountable for those. I think that's been a particular area of interest in this chat, and I hope I've reflected 7 or 8 comments adequately with one small question.
Well, I'll go to the funder accountability thing, which is funders are basically accountable for not stealing the money and not a whole lot more. And if you think of the investment industry, if investing firms were not accountable for profit, think what a mess industry would be. And so at Mulago, we're trying to make ourselves accountable for scalable solutions and accountable for the impact that they create. And that completely changes the dynamic with the doers, because our money doesn't mean anything unless they can turn it into impact. And so we end up, it turns out impact is harder to find than money. And we end up really grateful to anybody who can create it. And so we do become partners in this long-term journey to scale. We're meaningless unless they actually take that solution to scale with ours and others' money.
So I'm hearing a little bit about just the dependency that donors have on doers, and the cognitive dissonance between that dependency and accountability. Daniel, would you like to talk a little bit about indicators, values, and goals?
Yeah, who should actually define and frame the goals and the world views and the indicators and the methods, all of that. And of course, it remains a great challenge with our own work, I believe, that many parts, large parts even of that definition work, defining project goals, defining agendas, defining world views, indicators, how to measure what's the rationale of success in the end, and so on. It's coming from top down, and we have very complicated sets of rules and mechanisms and commissioning processes. Even in our own organizations, not everybody understands all of them, and we have specialized people to deal with that. So it remains a great challenge to me, and a good example to me still are increasing scales within projects that want to have increased ambition on one side, and then our complicated set of rules and kind of top-down definition work of all the project ingredients starts rolling. And we try to get that buy-in, of course, on a letter from partner organizations. In the end, when we came up with a great project proposal after 2 or 3 years, and if we think at even bigger projects, we might need 4 years or 5 years to prepare them. If we think at high ambitions that maybe trying to spend $100 million at once or so. But the bigger they are, and the bigger the buy-in that I ask from partners, if you think at transformative change on that higher levels, if I ask a partner, for example, would you like to engage in agriculture transformation or even economic transformation? And we will be prepared to spend $100 million for that. Would you buy in on that? Of course, the answer will always be, or in the most cases, will be no. We don't know yet. How can we? And it needs to emerge within our society and so on. So I think we are part of the problem, yes. And to me, the only way out is to descale. It may sound paradox, but to descale for the beginning, start small again, and start and let things and ownership and ambition and all of that emerge as much as possible, and find new ways of development governance where we for example, replace parts of the reporting with real co-creative formats that co-create progress, including indicators that we believe are important, and perceptions and qualitative perceptions of joint sense making, where we do this together between partners, commissioning organizations, and implementing agencies. How much time do we spend, for example, with reporting, others not fully understanding and asking back, and going back and forth in very formal processes? If we could replace parts of the time we spend for that with real-time co-production and making progress together, joint sense making together with the partners and so on, as a new way of sensing and monitoring progress and so on, then to me, all of this will be related to these kind of power issues as well. Finding truly reciprocal relationships and processes.
Well, I have to say the absolute worst job of being a moderator is having to stop short not only a very engaging conversation verbally, but also through the chat box, but also such as clearly a complex issue that we've only scratched the surface. I see a number of calls for concrete examples that we can share. And I would just point to both of your works. The SSIR piece gives some great examples, Kevin, around community healthcare workers, and Daniel, the Transforming Projects report certainly is packed full of examples. But certainly if there's others that you might be willing to share when we follow up with the slides and other information, I think that would be greatly appreciated. I want to leave time to turn this over to both Richard Kuhl and Johannes to both provide some reflections and some concluding comments. I do want to take this moment to thank both you and Daniel and Kevin and my co-moderator Liz and all of you for really, I would say, a very engaging and insightful conversation. And one, Larry, that clearly is just, I would say, a step in this journey, as you rightly said, that I'm glad to hear you're not ready to rest until we really sort of peel back the onion further. A lot that I heard, I won't even begin to summarize, but I'll just say three quick things that just really struck me. I think in this conversation, it really struck me that a lot of the means have become ends in of themselves inadvertently, right? So scaling a project has become perhaps an end, when in fact we're really thinking about how projects can be used to enact and maintain a change in the system. We talked a lot about indicators, right? And how those in of themselves have become goals versus signposts for learning and adapting and course correcting where needed. The second thing is, I think we talked a lot about the need for thinking about systems change from the doer's perspective. That, Kevin, you talk about at the end of the day, I think those who matter most are those who are actually delivering at large scale, those doers. And what does that look like, as we talked about, when it's perhaps weak institutions or dysfunctional governments, and how might resilience play into that? This idea of action leading to knowledge, rather than perhaps we inadvertently think knowledge will lead to action, something sitting in a research institute I certainly take to heart. And also the importance of co-learning. A lot of comments, I think, as well about social movements and collective action. And then finally, I would just say, I think a lot of what I heard us talk about sort of vacillated between the aspirational and the sort of real world we live in today, and maybe to think about how do we best bridge that, right? So these calls for, flexibility and agility and adaptiveness, whether it's the implementer or the funder, and so forth. But really, I think also a real recognition of how much of that can we expect to change, and what do we do to work within the systems that we currently live in. So a lot there, but with that, I just would love, Richard, to hand it over to you to share some reflections or thoughts, given the real impressive work you did in synthesizing and helping us make sense of some of the paradigms and discourse and literature out there on scaling and systems change. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Jenny, and everybody, and thank you, Kevin and Daniel, for your engagement with this issue. I think it's a fair assessment to say that we didn't resolve these tensions in an hour, and I think anybody who had those expectations, I'm sorry if you were disappointed, but I think that was pretty unrealistic. I think what we've done a really good job, though, is outline how complicated this issue itself is. And I want to particularly acknowledge a couple things, I think, picking up on something that Jenny just said. Daniel, I was particularly struck, on the one hand, by your hope and aspirations in outlining what a VUCA world is and the need, I don't know why, but at least in English, it seems that all the words we use to talk about addressing them start with C's: cooperation, coordination, collective action, complexity. And at the same time, you were incredibly honest about both the challenges within GIZ in terms of your own ways of dealing with this, and frankly, even within Germany. Given the situation, you said that it took 30 years, to make an energy transition that's still ongoing. The performance in rolling out corona vaccines has been disappointing. And I think, how do we hold both? I think really raised to me as a question, because not that I'm going to argue, despite my last name, that Germany is the best country in the world or the most bureaucratically effective, but certainly there's a long history of social partners working together and a lot of money and intellectual capital and functioning institutions. And if a country like that has the challenges that you were very gracious to be honest about and share, what does that say for the rest of us or multiple countries? I guess I came away with a couple of questions I'd just like to put on the table. Kevin, one of the things that you mentioned several times, and it's also in what you've written, is, you not only need a good idea, but you want to see a passionate doer, somebody who's willing, who's got the hunger to take this all the way and to, work through all the problems. And one of the things that struck me we didn't talk about, but I just wanted to put on the table, is that a lot of the innovation space, and especially investments that donors and others have put in research, and I know Malago doesn't do this, but many do, is invest in ideas without doers. There's a huge network of agricultural research institutions. There's a lot of donors investing in universities that come up with ideas, but those professors are not interested in creating social enterprises. And I'm just curious, what do we do with that stuff? There's a lot of great ideas out there that don't have somebody who wants to do something without them to take them to scale or affect systems change. And I think, for me, this is a really critical question and closely related to a secondary question, which is, who can take on systems change? Kevin, you basically, sort of argued that by and large it's emergent from the whole is greater than the parts. When you have a lot of actors, social entrepreneurs out there doing something in a similar field, that somehow synergies get created. You mentioned in the chat, or somebody did this, that the community health workers movement sort of came together and created a movement. But I've talked to a lot of Ministry of Health people and other people who say we're just flooded with social entrepreneurs. I don't know how many Malago funds, but if between Malago and Skoll and Gates and Grand Challenges and all the other funders, there's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of social entrepreneurs all knocking on the doors of either, especially if they have public sector scaling models, where the doer and the payer is a public sector, it doesn't seem like a synergy. It seems overwhelming. And how do we solve that collective action problem? I'm not so convinced that the whole is greater than let's put it this way. I think it's a question worth examining. That is the whole greater than the sum of its parts, or is there challenges there? So I know I don't have a lot more time here. I think the other thing that I would just flag is I think one of the things that emerged from the chat, and Jenny, you flagged this as well, is that we really have accountability problems. So in the bilaterals and donors and others, which is if they're only accountable to taxpayers or boards of directors or others, we not beneficiaries, not actors in the systems, we are not going to get the results we want. And how do we change that? So I'll stop there and pass it on to Johannes.
Sorry, may I very shortly intervene? It seems that one problem has been solved, that the German way of managing vaccinations. I just got the call that we and our family are called for vaccination, and we have to drop everything and move and drive now. So at least we so apologies. Thank you so much for having me, and for sharing all of these great ideas. I really would look forward to continue that debate. It's a real important connection you made between these topics, and all the best. I'll leave you here.
Thanks, thanks, Daniel. So take care, get your shot, and get on with business. So that's great. So I'm Johannes Linn, and I'm the co-chair and co-founder of the Scaling Up Community of Practice. And on behalf of Larry and myself, I just want to thank you all, everybody, for a really terrific session, which is kind of for us a first step, because it's the first effort of this cross-cutting kind of a freestanding cross-cutting webinar, and it's worked out very well. I think with almost 90 participants, it's been really quite a show. I have to say, Jenny and Liz, our moderators, thank you very much. Daniel, Kevin, great. You're sort of getting the discussion flowing and giving us lots of thought. Richard Cole, as our trusted scaling expert and analyst, and that paper you put together. I should also thank Laura Giron, Sabrina Storm, and Leonard Waltering, who were co-organizers of this event, and Natalie Coangelo, who managed the logistics. So thanks to you. But thanks to everybody with all those great questions and comments that you put into the chat box. We'll pull those together for our own benefit. And actually, one of our next steps is for Richard to pull together a summary of this event. And I think we'll make sure that we see rather carefully, and make sure, by the way, Natalie, please make sure we save the chat box. So thank you to you all. My own takeaway, just one sentence, is that I sort of feel clearly we need to, how should I put it? We need to be walk and chew gum, is that it? Or we need to clap with both hands, or we need to be able to play a violin. I mean, our two hands when we play a violin do very different things, but in the end actually produces rather good results. So I think we need to think simultaneously about how do we scale and how do we change systems as appropriate and depending on who we are. So I think the two are really need to go hand in hand, and whatever we do and wherever we are in this process, I think we need to have both aspects under consideration. Now, in terms of next steps, I already mentioned that Richard will prepare a summary, which will circulate to everybody with the main takeaways and main ideas that were discussed. We will, on our side, as a second step, we will reach out, as Larry, myself, and the team, to the working group heads from our community of practice to make sure that they actually take some of these discussions and ideas into their working groups, because these issues may be somewhat different depending on what area you're operating in, what sector or what particular aspect you're focused on. We also want to do a survey of our membership to see where is your energy in Turkey in terms of taking this topic a step forward. And then we'll explore, and I don't have any very specific steps yet in mind, but we'll explore how to best follow up, just to make sure this isn't just a one-off event and we'll all turn to other issues, but that we make sure we keep this debate alive and make progress. We will also, I believe, turn to some of the other cross-cutting issues, such as how do we mainstream scaling into organizations. But we'll keep you posted. Please, for those of you who are not yet members of the community practice, please sign up, please register, so we can keep you engaged and we can keep track of you, and vice versa. You can, more importantly, you can keep track of what the community practice is doing and contribute to its work. Thanks very much, Larry. Do you want any more things I have forgotten?
No, just adding my thanks to yours for what I thought was a splendid session.
Great, then thanks a lot to everybody and goodbye.